What if I told you that two men walked this earth with such divine power that one never tasted death, swept into heaven by a chariot of fire, while the other performed miracles so profound that even his bones brought the dead back to life? Long before these prophets emerged, God spoke through ancient seers about a time of great darkness when his voice would seem silent and his people would bow to demons disguised as gods. That time came when a foreign queen seized control of Israel, slaughtering God's prophets and erecting temples to Baal across the land. The nation stood on the edge of complete apostasy until heaven tore open and sent a man clothed in camel hair who would seal the sky for 3 years with a single word. His name meant "My God is Yahweh," and he came not with political power or armies, but with such raw prophetic authority that kings trembled and nature itself obeyed his commands. But here's what most people don't know. His greatest miracle wasn't calling fire from heaven or raising the dead. It was finding the one man worthy to carry a double portion of his mantle. These two prophets didn't just perform miracles. They fulfilled ancient prophecies and foreshadowed the coming Messiah in ways that will leave you stunned. Their story isn't just history. It's a blueprint for supernatural faith in impossible times. The kingdom of Israel had seen many kings, but none as wicked as Ahab. The writer of 1 Kings chapter 16 makes this painfully clear when describing his reign. Ahab didn't just continue the sins of the kings before him, he took evil to an entirely new level. His biggest mistake was his marriage to a woman named Jezebel, the daughter of the king of Sidon. She wasn't from Israel, and she brought with her the worship of Baal, a false god that her people believed controlled storms and made crops grow. Jezebel wasn't content to worship Baal privately. She used her position as queen to push this false religion onto all of Israel. 1 Kings 16 verse 32 tells us that Ahab set up an altar for Baal in a temple he built in Samaria, the capital city. But he didn't stop there. He also made an Asherah pole, which was another idol connected to fertility worship. The text says that Ahab did more to provoke the Lord, the God of Israel, to anger than all the kings of Israel who came before him. The situation grew darker. Jezebel brought hundreds of prophets of Baal and prophets of Asherah into the land, giving them positions of power and influence. She fed them at her own table and protected them with royal authority. Meanwhile, she hunted down the prophets of the true God. These men who spoke for the Lord were being killed one by one. The worship of the God who had brought Israel out of Egypt, who had given them the promised land, was being systematically destroyed. The people of Israel watched all this happen, and most of them simply went along with it. They bowed their knees to Baal. They kissed the idols. They abandoned the covenant their ancestors had made with God at Mount Sinai. It seemed like the light of true worship was about to be snuffed out completely. The nation was forgetting who they were and whose they were. Into this darkness a man appeared. His name was Elijah, which means, "My God is Yahweh." We don't know much about where he came from. The Bible simply calls him Elijah the Tishbite, from Tishbe in Gilead. He wasn't from a priestly family. He had no royal connections. He just showed up one day in King Ahab's palace with a message that would change everything. 1 Kings chapter 17 verse 1 records his words. "As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years except at my word." That was it. No long speech, no explanation. Just a bold declaration that the rain was going to stop and it would only start again when Elijah said so. This wasn't just a weather forecast. It was a direct challenge to Baal himself. The whole reason people worshipped Baal was because they believed he controlled the rain and made their crops grow. Now this prophet of the Lord was declaring that Baal had no power at all. The true God was shutting off the rain, and the false god couldn't do anything about it. Ahab must have been stunned. Who was this man to walk into the palace and make such a claim? But before the king could respond or ask questions, Elijah was gone. He disappeared as suddenly as he had appeared, leaving the king angry and confused. The prophet's clothing marked him as different from the start. He wore a garment made of hair and had a leather belt around his waist. This simple, rough clothing showed that he wasn't interested in comfort or fitting in with society. He was set apart for God's purposes, and everything about him declared whose side he was on. After delivering his message to Ahab, Elijah needed to hide. The king would certainly be looking for him, especially as the drought began and people started to suffer. But God had a plan for his prophet's safety. The word of the Lord came to Elijah with clear instructions, as we read in 1 Kings 17, verse 3. "Leave here, turn eastward, and hide in the Kerith ravine, east of the Jordan." This wasn't just any hiding place. The Kerith ravine was outside of Ahab's territory, across the Jordan River. Elijah would be safe there from the king's reach. But there was another problem. If there was no rain, how would Elijah survive? Where would he find food and water in a time of drought? God had already thought of that. Verse 4 contains an extraordinary promise. "You will drink from the brook, and I have directed the ravens to supply you with food there." Ravens, birds that most people considered unclean and worthless, would become God's delivery service. Elijah obeyed. He went to the Kerith ravine and did exactly what the Lord told him to do, and the provision started immediately. Every morning, ravens brought him bread and meat. Every evening they came again with more bread and meat. Day after day, these birds flew to the ravine carrying food in their beaks, dropping it off for the prophet and flying away. Elijah drank fresh water from the brook that flowed through the ravine. Think about what this meant. While the rest of the land was beginning to suffer from lack of rain, while crops were starting to fail and people were getting worried, Elijah had everything he needed. God was taking care of him in a way that was both miraculous and practical. The brook provided water, the ravens provided food. Nothing was lacking. This went on for quite some time. Elijah lived alone in that ravine, sustained by daily miracles, hidden from those who wanted to harm him. But eventually, because there was no rain anywhere in the land, even the brook began to dry up. 1 Kings 17, verse 7 tells us simply, "Sometime later the brook dried up because there had been no rain in the land." When that happened, God had new instructions ready for his prophet. The word of the Lord came to Elijah again with surprising directions. Verse 8 of 1 Kings 17 records God telling him, "Go at once to Zarephath in the region of Sidon and stay there. I have directed a widow there to supply you with food." This command must have seemed strange. Sidon was Jezebel's homeland, the very place where Baal worship was strongest. God was sending his prophet into enemy territory. When Elijah arrived at the town gate of Zarephath, he saw a widow gathering sticks. He called to her and asked, "Would you bring me a little water in a jar so I may have a drink?" As she was going to get it, he called out again, "And bring me, please, a piece of bread." Her response revealed just how desperate the situation had become. She answered, "As surely as the Lord your God lives, I don't have any bread, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little olive oil in a jug. I am gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." This was her last meal. She was preparing to cook whatever she had left, feed her son one final time, and then wait for starvation to take them both. But Elijah had a message from God for her. 1 Kings 17, verses 13 and 14 record his words, "Don't be afraid. Go home and do as you have said. But first, make a small loaf of bread for me from what you have and bring it to me, and then make something for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says, the jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry, until the day the Lord sends rain on the land." What Elijah was asking seemed impossible and even cruel. How could he ask a starving widow to feed him first, using up the last food she had? But this was actually a test of faith. Would she trust the promise of this prophet's God, even when everything in her situation said there was no hope? The woman made her choice. She went and did exactly what Elijah told her to do. She used her last bit of flour and oil to make bread for the prophet first. And then the miracle began. Verse 16 tells us the result. For the jar of flour was not used up, and the jug of oil did not run dry, in keeping with the word of the Lord spoken by Elijah. Day after day, the widow would reach into that jar, and there would be flour. She would tip the jug, and oil would pour out. It never ran out. There was always enough for another meal, not an abundance overflowing everywhere, but always exactly what they needed. Elijah, the widow, and her son ate from that miraculous supply throughout the drought. Every single day, God proved his faithfulness through that flour and that oil. After living in the widow's house for some time, something terrible happened. Her son became ill. 1 Kings 17, verse 17 says that the sickness grew worse and worse until finally he stopped breathing. The boy was dead. The woman who had shown such faith, who had trusted God's promise through Elijah, now held her dead son in her arms. Her grief turned to anger and confusion. She said to Elijah in verse 18, "What do you have against me, man of God? Did you come to remind me of my sin and kill my son?" In her pain, she thought God was punishing her for something in her past. Maybe she had done things she wasn't proud of. Maybe she thought this tragedy was payment for old mistakes. Elijah's response was immediate and compassionate. He said to her, "Give me your son." He took the boy from her arms and carried him up to the upper room where he was staying. Then he laid the child on his own bed. What happened next shows us the heart of a prophet who truly cared. Elijah cried out to the Lord. Verse 20 records his prayer. "Lord my God, have you brought tragedy even on this widow I am staying with by causing her son to die?" He was wrestling with God, asking hard questions. Then he made a desperate plea. He stretched himself out on the boy 3 times and cried out, "Lord my God, let this boy's life return to him." It was a physical prayer. Elijah wasn't standing at a distance speaking formal words. He was lying on top of the child, as if trying to give his own life to bring the boy back. He did this 3 times, each time calling out to God with everything in him. And God heard. Verse 22 tells us simply, "The Lord heard Elijah's cry, and the boy's life returned to him, and he lived." The child began to breathe again. His heart started beating. Life came back into his body. This was the first time in the Bible that anyone had been raised from death, and it happened through the prayer of this prophet in a foreign land. Elijah picked up the child and carried him downstairs. He gave him back to his mother with these words from verse 23, "Look, your son is alive." The woman's response showed that her faith had gone to an entirely new level. She said to Elijah, "Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth." What had been growing faith was now absolute certainty. She had seen the power of God over death itself. The drought continued. 3 years passed with no rain falling on the land. The famine became severe. Animals were dying. People were desperate. And in the 3rd year, the word of the Lord came to Elijah with new instructions. 1 Kings 18 verse 1 records God saying, "Go and present yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain on the land." This meant going back into danger. Ahab had been searching for Elijah everywhere during these 3 years. The king blamed the prophet for all the suffering the drought had caused. But Elijah obeyed. He started his journey back to face the king. Meanwhile, Ahab was so desperate for water that he personally went out searching for it. He called his palace administrator, a man named Obadiah, and together they planned to search every spring and valley in the land. If they could find enough grass, maybe they could keep at least some of their horses and mules alive. They split up to cover more ground, each going in a different direction. What Ahab didn't know was that Obadiah was secretly a believer in the Lord. When Jezebel had been killing the Lord's prophets, Obadiah had hidden 100 of them in 2 caves, 50 in each cave. He had been bringing them bread and water, risking his own life to keep them alive. Now, as he was walking along looking for water, he suddenly came face to face with Elijah. Obadiah recognized him immediately. He bowed down and asked, "Is it really you, my lord Elijah?" When Elijah confirmed who he was and told Obadiah to go tell Ahab that he was here, Obadiah became afraid. He knew that Ahab had been searching for Elijah everywhere. The king had even made other nations swear they didn't know where the prophet was hiding. Obadiah was worried that as soon as he left, the Spirit of the Lord would carry Elijah away somewhere else, and then Ahab would kill Obadiah for lying to him. But Elijah swore an oath recorded in verse 15. "As the Lord Almighty lives whom I serve, I will surely present myself to Ahab today." That promise was enough. Obadiah went to tell the king, and Ahab immediately went to meet Elijah. When Ahab saw him, his first words were an accusation. Verse 17 records him saying, "Is that you, you troubler of Israel?" From the king's perspective, Elijah was the cause of all their problems. This prophet had announced the drought, and now the land was dying because of it. Elijah didn't back down. He turned the accusation right back on the king. Verse 18 gives us his bold response. "I have not made trouble for Israel, but you and your father's family have. You have abandoned the Lord's commands and have followed the Baals." The real troublemakers were Ahab and his house. They were the ones who had turned the nation away from God. Then Elijah issued a challenge that would change everything. He told Ahab to summon all of Israel to meet him on Mount Carmel, and he didn't just want the people there. He wanted all 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who ate at Jezebel's table to come as well. It was time for a showdown. It was time to prove once and for all who the real God was. Ahab did what Elijah said. He sent word throughout Israel and assembled the prophets on Mount Carmel. When everyone had gathered, Elijah stood before them all and spoke directly to the people. 1 Kings 18 verse 21 records his challenge. "How long will you waver between 2 opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him." The people said nothing. They stood there in silence, unable or unwilling to make a choice. They had been trying to worship both God and Baal, hedging their bets, keeping their options open. But Elijah was forcing them to decide. Then Elijah pointed out the obvious. He said in verse 22, "I am the only one of the Lord's prophets left, but Baal has 450 prophets." It was one man against hundreds. The odds couldn't have been more lopsided. But Elijah wasn't worried about the numbers. He proposed a test. They would bring 2 bulls for sacrifice. The prophets of Baal could choose whichever one they wanted and prepare it on an altar, but they wouldn't light the fire. Elijah would prepare the other bull the same way on a separate altar, also without lighting a fire. Then the prophets of Baal would call on their God, and Elijah would call on the Lord. Verse 24 explains the terms. "The God who answers by fire, he is God." Everyone agreed this was a fair test. The prophets of Baal went first. They took their bull, prepared it, and placed it on their altar. Then they began to call on Baal. From morning until noon, they shouted, "Baal, answer us." They danced around the altar they had made. But verse 26 tells us clearly, there was no response. No one answered. At noon, Elijah started mocking them. He suggested that maybe Baal was deep in thought or busy with something or traveling. Maybe he was sleeping and needed to be woken up. His sarcasm cut deep, but it also made a point. A real God shouldn't need to be awakened or found. The prophets of Baal became frantic. They shouted louder. They began slashing themselves with swords and spears, a common practice in their religion, until blood flowed all over them. This continued through the afternoon, right up until the time for the evening sacrifice. Verse 29 describes the result. There was no response, no one answered, no one paid attention. Their God was silent because their God didn't exist. When it was Elijah's turn, he called the people to come closer. He wanted everyone to see clearly what he was about to do. He took 12 stones, one for each of the tribes of Israel, and repaired the altar of the Lord that had been torn down. This was significant. He was using 12 stones to represent a united Israel, even though the kingdom had been divided for many years. He arranged the wood on the altar, cut the bull into pieces, and laid it on the wood. But then he did something that seemed to make no sense. He ordered that 4 large jars be filled with water and poured over the offering and the wood. Then he told them to do it again, then a third time. 1 Kings 18, verse 35 tells us that the water ran down around the altar and even filled the trench he had dug around it. Why would he drench everything with water before asking God to send fire? Because Elijah wanted there to be absolutely no doubt about what was going to happen. No one could claim he had hidden coals in the wood or used any trick to light the fire. Everything was soaking wet. Then, at the time of the evening sacrifice, Elijah stepped forward and prayed. His prayer, recorded in verses 36 and 37, was simple and direct. Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Verse 38 describes what happened. Then the fire of the Lord fell and burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and the soil, and also licked up the water in the trench. This wasn't just a little flame that lit the offering. This was a consuming fire from heaven that incinerated everything, the meat, the wood, even the stones of the altar itself. It evaporated all the water in an instant. When the people saw this display of raw power, they fell flat on their faces. They cried out together, "The Lord, He is God! The Lord, He is God!" They said it twice, as if once wasn't enough to express what they were feeling. There was no more wavering, no more trying to follow both the Lord and Baal. They had seen the truth with their own eyes. Elijah immediately gave an order. He commanded in verse 40, "Seize the prophets of Baal. Don't let anyone get away." The people grabbed all 450 prophets and took them down to the Kishon Valley. There, Elijah had them all executed. This might seem harsh, but under God's law, those who led Israel into idolatry were to be put to death. These false prophets had been deceiving the nation and leading them away from God for years. Justice was finally being carried out, and the voices that had been shouting Baal's name all day were silenced forever. After the prophets of Baal had been killed in the Kishon Valley, Elijah turned his attention to King Ahab. He told him in 1 Kings 18, verse 41, "Go, eat and drink, for there is the sound of a heavy rain." The prophet could already hear what was coming, even though the sky was still clear. The 3-year drought was finally about to end. While Ahab went off to eat and drink, Elijah climbed back up to the top of Mount Carmel. There, he bent down to the ground and put his face between his knees. This was a position of intense, focused prayer. He wasn't standing with his hands raised or walking around. He was crouched low, pressing into God with everything he had. Then Elijah told his servant, "Go and look toward the sea." The servant went up and looked out across the Mediterranean, then came back and reported, "There is nothing there." But Elijah wasn't discouraged. He simply said, "Go back," and sent him to look again. This happened 7 times. The servant would climb up, look out at the sea, see nothing but clear sky, and return with the same report. Each time, Elijah remained in that same position of prayer, waiting for God's answer. On the seventh time, something changed. The servant came back with different news. Verse 44 records his words, "A cloud as small as a man's hand is rising from the sea." It was tiny, barely noticeable against the vast expanse of sky, but it was there. That small cloud was the answer Elijah had been waiting for. It was the first sign that God was about to fulfill his promise. Immediately, Elijah told his servant, "Go and tell Ahab, hitch up your chariot and go down before the rain stops you." The warning was urgent because Elijah knew what was coming. He had learned to recognize the ways God worked, and that tiny cloud meant a storm was about to break over the land. Verse 45 describes how quickly things changed. Meanwhile, the sky grew black with clouds, the wind rose, a heavy rain started falling, and Ahab rode off to Jezreel. Within minutes, the clear sky turned dark. The wind began to blow. Then the rain came pouring down, ending 3.5 years of drought in a sudden deluge. But something remarkable happened to Elijah. The power of the Lord came on him in a supernatural way. He tucked his cloak into his belt and ran ahead of Ahab's chariot all the way to Jezreel. This was a distance of about 17 miles, and Elijah ran the entire way on foot, actually beating the king's horses to the city. His body was filled with strength that wasn't his own. The same God who had sent fire from heaven now gave his prophet the endurance to outrun a chariot through a rainstorm. When King Ahab arrived in Jezreel, he told his wife Jezebel everything that had happened on Mount Carmel. He described the contest between Elijah and the prophets of Baal. He told her about the fire falling from heaven and consuming the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and even the water. He explained how all the people had fallen on their faces and declared that the Lord was God. And then he told her the part that would enrage her most. Elijah had executed all 450 prophets of Baal with the sword. Jezebel's response was immediate and fierce. 1 Kings 19, verse 2, records her sending a messenger to Elijah with these words, "May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them." She was swearing an oath by her gods that within 24 hours Elijah would be as dead as her prophets. This wasn't an empty threat. Jezebel had the power and the ruthlessness to carry it out. This threat did something unexpected to Elijah. Here was a man who had just stood alone against 450 prophets. He had boldly confronted King Ahab. He had called down fire from heaven in front of the entire nation. He had executed false prophets without hesitation. He had prayed and ended a 3-year drought. He had supernaturally outrun a chariot. But when he heard Jezebel's threat, verse 3 tells us simply, Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. Fear gripped him in a way that all the previous opposition hadn't. Maybe it was the exhaustion from everything he had been through in such a short time. Maybe it was the realization that even after such a great victory, the battle wasn't over. The queen was still in power, still promoting Baal worship, still hunting God's servants. Maybe it was just the human reality that courage has its limits, and Elijah had reached his. He headed south immediately, traveling through Israel into the kingdom of Judah. He kept going until he reached Beersheba, the southernmost city in Judah. This was as far from Jezebel's reach as he could get, while still being in Israelite territory. But even that distance wasn't enough for him. When he arrived in Beersheba, he left his servant there and continued on alone into the wilderness beyond the city. He wanted to be completely alone, away from everyone and everything. Elijah walked a full day's journey into the desert. The landscape was harsh and barren, with no shade and no water. Finally, he came to a broom bush and sat down under its thin branches. The broom bush was a scraggly desert plant that didn't provide much shelter from the sun, but it was all that was available in that desolate place. And there, In complete isolation and exhaustion, Elijah hit rock bottom. 1 Kings 19, verse 4 records his prayer. "I have had enough, Lord. Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors." This was the prayer of a man who had completely given up. He wasn't asking God for help or strength or protection from Jezebel. He wasn't asking for another miracle or for guidance about what to do next. He was asking to die. The prophet who had raised a dead boy to life now wanted his own life to end. Think about what he was saying. "I have had enough." He was declaring himself finished, done, unable to continue. "Take my life." He wanted God to end it all right there in the desert. "I am no better than my ancestors." He felt like a complete failure. His ancestors had died without accomplishing what they hoped for, and now Elijah believed he was in the same position. He had tried to turn Israel back to God. He had risked everything, faced down the king, challenged hundreds of false prophets, and called down fire from heaven. And yet, even after the incredible display on Mount Carmel, where everyone had proclaimed that the Lord was God, Jezebel was still in power, still making threats, still promoting false worship. From Elijah's perspective, nothing had really changed in any lasting way. He believed he was the only one left who was faithful to God, and now even he was running away, hiding in the desert. What was the point of continuing? What was the point of fighting when the enemy seemed impossible to defeat? What difference had any of it made? These dark thoughts consumed him as he sat under that broom bush in the middle of nowhere, completely overwhelmed by despair. After praying this desperate prayer, Elijah simply lay down under the bush and fell asleep. He was done. He had nothing left to give. No more strength, no more courage, no more faith. Sleep was an escape from the crushing despair that was suffocating him, and he gave himself over to it completely, perhaps even hoping he wouldn't wake up. While Elijah slept in his exhaustion and despair, something happened that he didn't expect. Verse 5 of 1 Kings 19 tells us, "All at once an angel touched him and said, 'Get up and eat.' The gentle touch woke him from his sleep, and when he opened his eyes and looked around, he saw something remarkable. Right there by his head, close enough to reach, were a cake of bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water. This provision appeared in the middle of the desert, where absolutely nothing grew. Elijah hadn't brought food with him when he fled from Beersheba. There was no one else around for miles, but God had sent an angel to provide exactly what his prophet needed at that moment. Not a sermon about having more faith. Not a rebuke for running away from his calling. Not a lecture about trusting God more. Just simple, practical, compassionate care, fresh bread and clean water. Elijah ate the bread and drank the water. The food gave him some physical strength, but he was still so depleted, so tired in every way, physically, emotionally, spiritually, that even after eating, all he could do was lie back down and go to sleep again. And God let him. There was no rush, no pressure, no demand that he immediately get up and get back to work. The Lord understood that his prophet needed rest more than anything else right now. The angel came a second time. He touched Elijah again, waking him gently, and said in verse 7, "Get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you." This time there was a hint of what lay ahead, a journey that would require strength and endurance. But even so, the focus was still on meeting Elijah's immediate physical needs. The angel wasn't pushing him to do anything except take care of himself by eating and drinking. So Elijah got up again and ate and drank from the provision God had given him. The Bible doesn't tell us exactly how long he rested there in the desert between these two meals, but it was enough time for the food to begin restoring his strength. Verse 8 says, "Strengthened by that food, he traveled 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God." And then that simple provision from the angel, 2 meals of bread and water, sustained him for over a month of difficult travel through harsh terrain. This shows us something important about how God cares for his people. Sometimes the spiritual and emotional problems we face actually have physical roots. Elijah wasn't just spiritually depleted, he was physically exhausted and probably hungry and dehydrated from his flight into the desert. God knew that before his prophet could hear anything else or receive any other kind of help, he needed food, water, and rest. The Lord didn't shame him for his weakness. He didn't question his faith or his commitment. He simply took care of him like a father caring for his worn-out child. Strengthened by the food the angel had provided, Elijah began a long journey southward through the wilderness. His destination was Horeb, which was another name for Mount Sinai. This was the mountain where Moses had encountered God in the burning bush hundreds of years earlier. It was where God had appeared in fire and smoke and given the 10 Commandments to Israel. It was where the covenant between God and his people had been formally established. It was in many ways the birthplace of Israel as God's nation. The journey took 40 days and 40 nights of walking. This number appears over and over in the Bible and always carries significance. Moses had spent 40 days on this same mountain when he received the law from God. The Israelites had wandered for 40 years in the wilderness, not far from where Elijah was now walking. Jesus would later fast for 40 days in the wilderness. Now Elijah was traveling 40 days to reach this holy place. It was a journey not just through physical space, but through time, connecting him to the foundational moments of Israel's relationship with God. We don't know exactly what route Elijah took through the desert or what he thought about during those long weeks of solitary travel. The Bible doesn't give us those details or any description of the journey itself. But we can imagine a man walking alone through wilderness and wasteland, day after day, week after week, with nothing but his own thoughts and his unanswered questions. Why had things turned out this way? Why had God allowed Jezebel to remain in power even after Mount Carmel? Why did it feel like he was the only person in the entire nation who still cared about serving the true God? What was the point of everything he had done? When Elijah finally arrived at Horeb after his long journey, he found a cave somewhere on the mountain and went inside. 1 Kings 19, verse 9 tells us he spent the night there. After 40 days of traveling, he had reached the mountain of God, the place where Moses had met with the Lord face to face. But Elijah wasn't on top of the mountain meeting with God in glory and fire. He was hiding in a cave, sheltering himself from the world, just as he had hidden in the Kerith ravine years before, and in the widow's house in Zarephath. The cave offered shelter and safety from the elements and from anyone who might be looking for him. But it was also a place of isolation and withdrawal. Elijah was separating himself from the world, from his mission, from everything he had been called to do. He had come to the mountain where God had dramatically revealed himself to Moses and to the people of Israel, perhaps hoping for similar clarity and direction, or perhaps just wanting to be as far from Jezebel and Israel and all his problems as it was possible to get. While Elijah was in the cave, hiding from the world and nursing his despair, the word of the Lord came to him. God spoke to his prophet and asked him a simple, direct question recorded in verse 9. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" It was a short question, just 6 words, but it carried tremendous weight. This wasn't God asking for information. He knew exactly why Elijah was there, what had happened, and what the prophet was feeling. It was a question designed to make Elijah think and reflect. Why had he abandoned his post in Israel? Why had he run away? Why was he hiding in a cave on a mountain far from where God had called him to serve? Elijah's response came pouring out like water from a broken dam. All the frustration, disappointment, and despair he had been carrying erupted in a flood of words. Verse 10 records what he said. "I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too." Listen carefully to what he was saying. First, he defended himself. "I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty." He was telling God that he had worked hard, that he had done everything he was supposed to do, that he had given his absolute best effort to the mission. He had been passionate and committed and faithful. Second, he listed all the problems and failures he saw around him. The Israelites had rejected God's covenant. They had turned their backs on their relationship with the Lord. They had torn down God's altars. The places where people were supposed to worship him were being destroyed. They had killed God's prophets. The people who spoke for the Lord were being hunted down and murdered. Everything was falling apart. Third, and most significantly, he expressed his sense of complete isolation. "I am the only one left." Elijah believed he was the last faithful person in the entire nation. Everyone else had either turned to Baal or been killed. He stood alone, the final defender of a lost cause, and finally he revealed his fear. "Now they are trying to kill me too." After everything he had done, after all his zeal and effort, the enemy was still winning, and now they were coming for him. It was hopeless. This complaint revealed where Elijah's focus had shifted. He had stopped seeing God's power and started seeing only the opposition and problems. He had forgotten about the fire falling from heaven on Mount Carmel and was fixated on Jezebel's death threat. He had lost sight of the thousands of people who had fallen on their faces and cried out, "The Lord, He is God," and had convinced himself that he was completely alone. God's response to Elijah's complaint was unexpected. He didn't argue with the prophet or correct his perspective right away. He didn't defend himself or explain why things had happened the way they had. Instead, he gave Elijah an experience that would teach him something crucial about how God works. Verse 11 of 1 Kings 19 records the Lord telling him, "Go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." So Elijah left the cave and went out to stand on the mountainside. Then something dramatic began to happen. A wind came through, not a normal wind, but a powerful, violent wind so strong that it literally tore the mountains apart and shattered rocks into pieces. This was a supernatural display of raw, overwhelming power, the kind of force that makes humans feel small and helpless. But the text tells us something important. The Lord was not in the wind. After the wind died down, an earthquake struck. The ground shook violently beneath Elijah's feet. The mountain trembled and heaved. This too was a display of awesome, terrifying power that would make anyone fall to their knees. But again, the Bible states clearly, the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake subsided, fire appeared. Flames erupted on the mountain, perhaps recalling the fire that had consumed the sacrifice on Mount Carmel, or the fire that had appeared when God gave Moses the law on this same mountain centuries before. Fire often represented God's presence in Scripture, but once more we're told directly, the Lord was not in the fire. These three dramatic demonstrations, wind, earthquake, and fire, were exactly the kind of powerful displays that people expected from God. They were similar to how God had appeared at Mount Sinai when he gave the law to Moses. They were the kind of spectacular shows of force that make people stand in awe. But God was showing Elijah that his presence wasn't limited to those kinds of manifestations. Then came something completely different. After all the noise and violence and power, verse 12 describes a gentle whisper. Other Bible translations call it a still small voice or a soft murmuring sound or a low whisper. After all the dramatic displays, God spoke in a voice so quiet that Elijah had to be completely still and attentive to hear it at all. When Elijah heard this gentle whisper, something in him responded. He pulled his cloak over his face, a sign of reverence and recognition that he was in the presence of God. And he went out and stood at the entrance to the cave. The mighty displays of wind, earthquake, and fire hadn't drawn him fully out of his hiding place, but the gentle whisper did. God was teaching his prophet something profound. Yes, he could work through spectacular displays of power, like the fire on Mount Carmel or the parting of the Jordan River. But that wasn't his only way of working, and it wasn't even his primary way most of the time. More often, he works quietly, subtly, in ways that require us to be still and listen carefully. The still, small voice was just as much God's presence as the consuming fire had been, maybe even more so, because it required faith and attention to perceive it. Standing at the entrance of the cave, with his face covered in reverence, Elijah heard a voice asking him the same question he had heard before. Verse 13 records it. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" God was giving him another opportunity to process why he had run, why he was hiding, what he was really struggling with deep down, and Elijah gave exactly the same answer as before. Word for word, he repeated what he had said earlier in verse 14. "I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too." Nothing had changed in his perspective. He was still stuck in the same place mentally and emotionally, still seeing only the problems and opposition, still feeling utterly alone and defeated. But God didn't argue with him. He didn't tell him he was wrong or correct his thinking directly. Instead, he gave him something concrete to do, a path forward. Verses 15 through 17 contain specific, clear instructions. "Go back the way you came and go to the desert of Damascus. When you get there, anoint Hazael king over Aram. Also, anoint Jehu son of Nimshi king over Israel, and anoint Elisha son of Shaphat from Abel Meholah to succeed you as prophet. Jehu will put to death any who escape the sword of Hazael, and Elisha will put to death any who escape the sword of Jehu." These were clear, specific assignments. 3 men to anoint, 3 major changes to set in motion. God was showing Elijah that his work wasn't finished, that there was still a plan moving forward, that history was going to continue unfolding, and Elijah had an important role to play in it. The judgment on Israel's idolatry would indeed come, but it would come through these 3 men working together over time, not through one dramatic confrontation. Notice that one of the men Elijah was to anoint was his own successor. God was telling him that he wouldn't bear this burden alone forever, that someone else would carry on the prophetic ministry when Elijah's time was done. This wasn't a rebuke, but a relief. The weight didn't rest entirely on his shoulders. Then God addressed the core of Elijah's complaint, the belief that had been crushing him more than anything else, his conviction that he was completely alone. Verse 18 contains words that must have stunned the prophet. "Yet I reserve 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed down to Baal and whose mouths have not kissed him." 7,000 people, 7,000 faithful believers scattered throughout Israel. Elijah wasn't the only one left at all. God had preserved a faithful remnant throughout the nation, thousands of people who had refused to worship Baal, who had kept their covenant with the Lord, who had remained true even when it seemed like everyone around them had fallen away. Elijah had been so focused on Jezebel and Ahab, so consumed by the visible opposition of the prophets of Baal, so overwhelmed by the public apostasy, that he had completely missed what God was quietly doing throughout the land. Those 7,000 weren't prominent public figures. They weren't making dramatic stands or calling down fire from heaven. They were simply remaining faithful in their homes and towns and villages, quietly serving God even when it wasn't popular or safe to do so. God saw every single one of them, even though Elijah hadn't, and he was preserving them for his purposes. Leaving Mount Horeb with his new assignments from God, Elijah set out to find the man who would one day take his place. God had told him to anoint Elisha, son of Shaphat from Abel-Meholah, as the prophet to succeed him. So Elijah traveled north, back toward Israel, searching for this man he had never met. When he found Elisha, the scene was ordinary and agricultural. 1 Kings 19 verse 19 tells us, "So Elijah went from there and found Elisha, son of Shaphat. He was plowing with 12 yoke of oxen, and he himself was driving the 12th pair." This detail about the 12 yoke of oxen is significant. Most farmers owned 1 or maybe 2 oxen. Having 12 yoke meant Elisha came from a wealthy family with substantial land and resources. This wasn't a poor man struggling to survive. He had security, status, and a comfortable future ahead of him. Elisha was working alongside his servants, driving the last pair of oxen himself. He was in the middle of his daily work, probably thinking about the field he was plowing and the crops that would be planted there. He had no idea his entire life was about to change in the next few seconds. Elijah approached him and did something simple but profound. The verse continues, "Elijah went up to him and threw his cloak around him." That was it. No words of explanation, no introduction, no discussion about what this meant or what Elisha would be required to do. Just the physical act of throwing his cloak, his mantle, over Elisha's shoulders as he passed by. But this simple gesture communicated everything that needed to be said. In that culture, a prophet's cloak represented his authority and calling. By throwing it over Elisha, Elijah was symbolically transferring his prophetic office to this younger man. It was a call to leave everything behind and enter into a completely different life. A life of serving God as his spokesman, of facing danger and opposition, of depending on supernatural provision. Without any words being spoken, Elisha understood exactly what was happening. Elisha's response to this unexpected calling was immediate. He didn't need time to think about it or discuss it with his family first. He left his oxen standing right there in the field and ran after Elijah. But he did have one request. Verse 20 records him saying, "Let me kiss my father and mother goodbye, and then I will come with you." It was a reasonable request. He wasn't asking to delay for days or weeks. He just wanted to say a proper farewell to his parents. But Elijah's response tested his commitment. Elijah said to him, "Go back. What have I done to you?" These words sound strange, almost like Elijah was withdrawing the call. But he wasn't. He was testing whether Elisha was truly committed or having second thoughts. Was this really what Elisha wanted, or was he looking for an excuse to stay in his comfortable life? Elisha's response proved his total commitment. Verse 21 tells us, "So Elisha left him and went back. He took his yoke of oxen and slaughtered them. He burned the plowing equipment to cook the meat and gave it to the people, and they ate." Think about what he was doing. He killed the oxen that represented his livelihood. He broke up his plowing equipment, the tools of his trade, and used them as firewood to cook the meat. Then he gave all that meat away to the people. This was a dramatic, irreversible action. Those oxen were valuable. That equipment was essential for farming. By destroying them, Elisha was burning his bridges. He was making it impossible to go back to his old life. There would be no returning to farming after this. No changing his mind in a few weeks and picking up where he left off. He was all in. The feast he provided for the people was both a celebration and a farewell. He was saying goodbye to his old life in a public way, sharing his wealth with his community one last time before walking away from it all. Then the verse concludes simply, "Then he set out to follow Elijah and became his servant." Elisha left his family, his property, his security, and his future plans. He walked away from everything to follow a prophet he had just met, entering into years of training for a calling he didn't fully understand yet. After Elisha made his commitment to follow Elijah, he entered into a period of service and learning that would last for several years. The Bible doesn't give us many details about this time, but we get glimpses of their relationship in various passages. In 2 Kings 3, verse 11, someone describes Elisha as the one who used to pour water on the hands of Elijah. This was the work of a servant, helping his master wash, attending to his daily needs, doing humble tasks. But Elisha wasn't just a servant. He was an apprentice, a disciple learning from a master. He was being trained in the ways of God, learning how to hear the Lord's voice, understanding what it meant to be a prophet in Israel. He watched Elijah interact with kings and common people. He saw how Elijah prayed. He witnessed miracles. He learned from both Elijah's great moments of faith and his times of struggle. During these years, Elijah continued his prophetic ministry throughout Israel. He confronted King Ahab about taking Naboth's vineyard. He pronounced judgment on Ahab's house. He dealt with Ahab's son Ahaziah after Ahab died. And through all of this, Elisha was there watching, learning, serving, and growing in his understanding of what it meant to speak for God. The relationship between them grew deep over time. Elijah became like a father to Elisha, and Elisha became like a son to Elijah. This wasn't just professional training. It was a spiritual father passing his mantle to a spiritual son, preparing him for the enormous responsibility he would one day carry. Elisha learned not just the techniques of prophecy, but the heart of a prophet, the burden of speaking God's words to a nation that often didn't want to hear them, the loneliness of standing for truth when everyone else compromised, the absolute dependence on God that was required. These years of faithful service and learning were essential preparation for everything that would come later. Elisha wasn't being trained in a school or through formal education. He was learning by living alongside Elijah day after day, year after year, absorbing not just knowledge but character, not just information, but a way of life devoted entirely to God and His purposes. The time eventually came when God was going to take Elijah to heaven. 2 Kings chapter 2, verse 1 tells us, when the Lord was about to take Elijah up to heaven in a whirlwind, Elijah and Elisha were on their way from Gilgal. Both prophets knew what was about to happen. This was their final journey together, and it would end with them being separated forever. As they walked from Gilgal, Elijah said to Elisha, "Stay here, the Lord has sent me to Bethel." He was trying to get Elisha to remain behind, but Elisha refused. He responded with an oath recorded in verse 2, "As surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you." So they went down to Bethel together. At Bethel, the company of prophets, a group of prophets who lived and trained together there, came out to meet Elisha. They asked him in verse 3, "Do you know that the Lord is going to take your master from you today?" Elisha answered, "Yes, I know, but do not speak of it." He knew what was coming, but he didn't want to discuss it. Perhaps he didn't want Elijah distracted by their comments, or perhaps his own grief was too raw to talk about. From Bethel, Elijah again tried to leave Elisha behind. Verse 4 records him saying, "Stay here, Elisha, the Lord has sent me to Jericho." But Elisha gave the same response, "As surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you." So they traveled to Jericho together. The same thing happened in Jericho. The company of prophets there came to Elisha and asked him the same question about Elijah being taken away that day. Elisha gave them the same answer. He knew, but they should be quiet about it. Then Elijah tried one more time to get Elisha to stay behind. Verse 6 tells us Elijah said, "Stay here. The Lord has sent me to the Jordan." And for the third time, Elisha refused to leave. "As surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you." This threefold testing revealed Elisha's absolute determination and loyalty. Each time Elijah tried to go on alone, Elisha insisted on staying with him. He wasn't going to abandon his master at this crucial moment. He wasn't going to miss whatever was about to happen. His commitment wasn't based on convenience or comfort. It was total and unshakable. So the two of them walked on together toward the Jordan River. 50 men from the company of prophets followed them, but stopped at a distance to watch what would happen. They knew something extraordinary was coming, and they wanted to witness it, even if only from far away. When Elijah and Elisha reached the Jordan River, they stood on its bank looking at the water flowing before them. Then Elijah did something that recalled the great miracles of Israel's past. 2 Kings 2, verse 8 describes what happened. Elijah took his cloak, rolled it up and struck the water with it. The water divided to the right and to the left, and the two of them crossed over on dry ground. This miracle was a direct echo of what had happened centuries before. When Joshua led Israel into the Promised Land, God had stopped the Jordan River's flow so the people could cross on dry ground. Even further back, Moses had raised his staff, and God had parted the Red Sea so Israel could escape from Egypt. Now Elijah, at the end of his ministry, was performing the same kind of miracle that the great leaders of Israel's past had witnessed. He took his cloak, that same mantle he had thrown over Elisha years before, rolled it up, and struck the water. The river immediately divided, creating a dry path through its midst. The water stood up on both sides like walls, held back by God's power. Then Elijah and Elisha walked across together on the riverbed, their feet on dry ground where moments before the Jordan had been flowing. The 50 prophets watching from a distance saw this happen. They witnessed the power of God working through Elijah one more time, confirming that he was indeed the Lord's prophet, that God's hand was on him in an unmistakable way. It was a fitting final public miracle. Elijah crossing through divided waters, just as Israel had crossed through divided waters when entering the land Joshua would give them. For Elisha, this miracle meant something additional. He had heard the stories of Moses and Joshua. He had learned about Israel's history and the mighty works God had done through his servants. Now he was experiencing that same power firsthand, walking on dry ground through the Jordan River, and he was about to inherit the mantle that had struck those waters, the prophetic authority that had commanded them to divide. On the other side of the Jordan, walking together through the wilderness beyond the river, Elijah turned to his disciple and asked him a question. 2 Kings 2 verse 9 records his words, "Tell me, what can I do for you before I am taken from you?" It was a generous offer, a final gift from master to student. Elijah was giving Elisha the opportunity to ask for whatever he wanted before they were separated. Elisha's request was bold and specific. He said, "Let me inherit a double portion of your spirit." This wasn't a request for twice as much power as Elijah had. In Israelite culture, the firstborn son received a double portion of his father's inheritance compared to the other sons. If a man had 3 sons, for example, his property would be divided into 4 parts. The firstborn got 2 parts, and the other sons got 1 part each. Elisha was essentially asking to be recognized as Elijah's firstborn son, his primary heir, the one who would carry on his spiritual legacy. Elijah's response showed that this was indeed a difficult thing to ask for. Verse 10 records him saying, "You have asked a difficult thing, yet if you see me when I am taken from you, it will be yours. If not, it will not." Elijah couldn't just grant this request on his own authority. Only God could give someone a double portion of prophetic spirit. But Elijah set a condition. If Elisha actually saw him when he was taken away, that would be the sign that God was granting his request. This condition wasn't arbitrary. It meant Elisha would need to maintain intense spiritual focus during the coming moment. His spiritual eyes would need to be open and alert. Only if he could perceive what was happening in the spiritual realm would he receive what he had asked for. It was a test of spiritual awareness and readiness. The 2 prophets continued walking together and talking, not knowing exactly when or how the moment would come. They were simply moving forward, master and disciple together, for these final moments, with Elisha's bold request hanging in the air between them and both of them watching for what God would do next. As Elijah and Elisha were walking along and talking together, something extraordinary happened without warning. 2 Kings 2 verse 11 describes the moment. Suddenly, a chariot of fire and horses of fire appeared and separated the two of them, and Elijah went up to heaven in a whirlwind. A chariot made of fire, pulled by horses made of fire, came down from heaven. This wasn't normal fire that burns and destroys. This was heavenly fire, glorious and supernatural. The fiery chariot came between Elijah and Elisha, physically separating them from each other. Then a whirlwind, a powerful tornado of wind, caught Elijah up and began carrying him upward toward heaven. Elisha saw it all happening. He watched as his master was taken from him, lifted up by the whirlwind, ascending higher and higher. His spiritual eyes were open enough to perceive this miraculous event. He cried out as it happened, and verse 12 records his words, my Father, the chariots and horsemen of Israel." This cry revealed several things. First, by calling Elijah my father, Elisha was acknowledging their relationship. Elijah had been like a father to him, and now he was losing him. Second, by calling him the chariots and horsemen of Israel, Elisha was recognizing Elijah's true importance. The prophet had been Israel's real defense and strength, worth more than all their military might. One man connected to God's power was more valuable than entire armies. As Elijah disappeared from sight, ascending into heaven, Elisha tore his garment, his own clothes, in two. This was a traditional expression of grief and mourning, a physical demonstration of the deep sorrow he felt. The mentor who had trained him, the spiritual father who had prepared him, the man he had served for years, was gone. Elisha stood there alone, looking up at the empty sky where Elijah had disappeared. This was only the second time in all of Scripture that someone had been taken directly to heaven without dying. Enoch had walked with God and then was no more because God took him. Now, centuries later, Elijah experienced the same kind of departure. He didn't get sick. He didn't grow old and die. He simply went from earth to heaven in a moment, transported by God's power in fire and wind. His dramatic exit matched the dramatic nature of his entire ministry. A man who had appeared suddenly, performed mighty miracles, and now departed in glory. After Elijah was taken up, and Elisha had torn his own clothes in grief, he looked down and saw something on the ground. Elijah's cloak, his mantle, had fallen from him during his ascent into heaven. 2 Kings 2, verse 13 tells us, Elisha then picked up Elijah's cloak that had fallen from him and went back and stood on the bank of the Jordan. This cloak was the same one Elijah had thrown over Elisha years before when calling him to prophetic ministry. It was the same one Elijah had rolled up and struck the Jordan River with just a short time ago, causing the waters to divide. Now it belonged to Elisha. It was his inheritance, the symbol of the prophetic authority that had been passed to him. Standing on the bank of the Jordan with Elijah's cloak in his hands, Elisha faced his first test. He took the cloak and struck the water, just as Elijah had done. But as he struck it, he cried out a question recorded in verse 14, "Where now is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" Some translations phrase it as a statement, "Where is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" Either way, Elisha wasn't expressing doubt. He was calling on the same God who had worked through Elijah to now work through him. When he struck the water, it divided to the right and to the left, just as it had for Elijah. The Jordan parted again, creating a dry path through its midst. Elisha crossed over on dry ground, walking back across the river he had crossed earlier with his master. The miracle proved that God's power hadn't left with Elijah. It was now working through Elisha. The 50 prophets who had been watching from a distance saw this happen. Verse 15 tells us their reaction. The company of the prophets from Jericho who were watching said, "The spirit of Elijah is resting on Elisha." And they went to meet him and bowed to the ground before him. They recognized immediately what had happened. The same prophetic spirit and authority that had rested on Elijah was now on Elisha. They showed him respect and honor, bowing before him in recognition of his new role. These same prophets wanted to send search parties to look for Elijah's body, thinking perhaps the Spirit of the Lord had dropped him on some mountain or in some valley. But Elisha told them no, knowing that Elijah was in heaven, not lying somewhere on earth. They kept insisting until Elisha finally gave in and let them search. For 3 days, 50 men searched the area but found nothing, exactly as Elisha had known would happen. The transition was complete. Elijah was gone, taken to heaven in a whirlwind of fire. Elisha now carried the prophetic mantle, confirmed by the miracle at the Jordan and recognized by the other prophets. The ministry that had begun with Elijah announcing a drought to King Ahab would now continue through Elisha, but with its own character and focus. The teacher had departed, and the student was ready to begin his own journey as God's prophet to Israel. After the prophets of Jericho had recognized Elisha as Elijah's successor, the men of the city came to him with a problem. 2 Kings 2, verse 19, records them saying, "Look, our Lord, this town is well situated as you can see, but the water is bad and the land is unproductive." Jericho was in a good location, but something was wrong with their water source. It was making people sick and causing the land to be barren. This problem likely traced back to Joshua's curse on Jericho hundreds of years earlier. When Joshua conquered the city, he had declared that whoever rebuilt it would lose his sons. The city had been rebuilt, and now the water that should have given life was bringing sickness and death instead. Elisha's response was simple and direct. Verse 20 tells us he said, "Bring me a new bowl and put salt in it." They brought him what he asked for, a bowl that had never been used before, filled with salt. Salt was known for its preserving and purifying qualities, but what Elisha was about to do wasn't based on salt's natural properties. This was going to be a miracle. Elisha went out to the spring where the water came from. This was the source of the problem, so this was where the solution needed to happen. He threw the salt into the spring and spoke words recorded in verse 21. "This is what the Lord says. I have healed this water. Never again will it cause death or make the land unproductive." It was a declaration of healing, a prophetic word that announced what God was doing at that moment. The result was immediate and permanent. Verse 22 tells us, "And the water has remained pure to this day, according to the word Elisha had spoken." The bad water became good. The spring that had been causing death and barrenness became a source of life and health. This was Elisha's first miracle as the recognized prophet of God, and it set the tone for his entire ministry. While Elijah's ministry had often emphasized judgment, shutting up the sky, calling down fire, pronouncing death on kings, Elisha's ministry would focus more on restoration, healing, and provision. The new prophet was bringing life where there had been death. Sometime later, a woman came to Elisha with a desperate problem. 2 Kings 4 verse 1 tells us, "The wife of a man from the company of the prophets cried out to Elisha, 'Your servant my husband is dead, and you know that he revered the Lord. But now his creditor is coming to take my 2 boys as his slaves.'" Her husband had been one of the prophets, a man who served God faithfully, but he had died owing money, and now the person he owed was about to take her sons as slaves to settle the debt. This was legal under Israelite law, but it was tragic. She was about to lose her children. Elisha asked her a question that seemed simple, but was actually crucial. Verse 2 records him saying, "How can I help you? Tell me, what do you have in your house?" He wanted to know what resources she had available. The widow's answer revealed just how desperate her situation was. She replied, "Your servant has nothing there at all, except a small jar of olive oil." That was it. Everything else of value had probably already been sold to try to pay the debt. All she had left was one small jar of oil. It seemed like nothing, certainly not enough to solve her problem. But Elisha saw possibility where she saw only lack. His instructions to her were specific and unusual. Verses 3 and 4 record what he told her. "Go around and ask all your neighbors for empty jars. Don't ask for just a few. Then go inside and shut the door behind you and your sons. Pour oil into all the jars, and as each is filled, put it to one side." She was to gather as many empty containers as possible from everyone around her, then go home, shut the door for privacy, and start pouring oil from her one small jar into all those empty vessels. The woman didn't question these strange instructions. She obeyed completely. She went around to all her neighbors and borrowed every jar and container they would lend her. Then she went home with her sons, shut the door, and began to pour. Her sons brought the empty jars to her one by one, and she poured oil from her small jar into each one. Something miraculous happened. The oil kept flowing and flowing. Verse 5 tells us, she kept pouring. One jar filled, then another, then another. The oil never ran out from that small jar. It just kept coming, filling jar after jar after jar. Finally, she said to her son in verse 6, "Bring me another one." But he replied, "There is not a jar left." They had filled every single container they had gathered. Only when there were no more empty jars did the oil stop flowing. The woman went back to Elisha and told him what had happened. His response gave her the solution to her crisis. Verse 7 records his words, "Go, sell the oil and pay your debts. You and your sons can live on what is left." She had enough oil to not only pay off everything she owed, but also to support herself and her sons afterward. The miracle saved her children from slavery and gave her family a future. God's provision matched her faith and her preparation. The oil continued as long as there were vessels to fill. One day, Elisha was passing through the town of Shunem when a wealthy woman who lived there urged him to stay for a meal. 2 Kings 4, verse 8 tells us that whenever he came by after that, he would stop there to eat. This woman recognized something special about Elisha. She knew he was a man of God, and she wanted to show him hospitality and support. She went beyond just feeding him when he passed through. She talked to her husband about making a more permanent arrangement. Verse 9 records her saying to him, "I know that this man who often comes our way is a holy man of God. Let's make a small room on the roof and put in it a bed and a table, a chair and a lamp for him. Then he can stay there whenever he comes to us." They built this room specifically for Elisha. It wasn't fancy, but it had everything he needed: a place to sleep, a table to eat at, a chair to sit on, and a lamp for light. This was their way of supporting God's prophet, giving him a place to rest and refresh himself as he traveled around Israel doing the Lord's work. One day, when Elisha came and went up to his room to rest, he wanted to do something for this generous woman in return. He called his servant Gehazi and told him to call her. When she came and stood before them, Elisha asked through Gehazi what could be done for her. Verse 13 records him asking, "You have gone to all this trouble for us. Now what can be done for you? Can we speak on your behalf to the king or the commander of the army?" It was a significant offer. Elisha had connections with people in power and could advocate for her if she needed something. But her response showed she was content with her life. She said, "I have a home among my own people." She wasn't looking for special favors or advancement. She was happy where she was. After she left, Elisha asked Gehazi what could be done for her. Gehazi pointed out something Elisha hadn't noticed. Verse 14 records his observation: "She has no son, and her husband is old." In that culture, not having a son was a source of deep sadness and also meant there would be no one to care for the parents in their old age or carry on the family name. The woman had everything except the one thing that mattered most to her. Elisha called her back. When she came and stood in the doorway, he spoke a promise to her recorded in verse 16. "About this time next year, you will hold a son in your arms." It was an incredible promise, exactly what her heart longed for, but her response showed she was almost afraid to believe it. She said, "No, my man of God, please do not mislead your servant." She had probably given up hope of ever having a child, and the thought of having that hope raised only to be disappointed was too painful. But Elisha's word came true. Verse 17 tells us simply, "But the woman became pregnant, and the next year about that same time she gave birth to a son, just as Elisha had told her." The woman who had asked for nothing received everything. Her generosity and hospitality to God's prophet brought an unexpected reward. The child she had longed for but never dared to ask for. The boy grew, and one day he went out to his father, who was with the reapers in the fields. It was harvest time, and the child wanted to be with his father watching the work, but suddenly something went terribly wrong. 2 Kings 4, verse 19, records the boy crying out, "My head, my head!" He was in severe pain, possibly from heat stroke or some sudden illness. His father told a servant to carry the boy to his mother. The servant picked him up and brought him to the Shunammite woman. She held her son on her lap, probably trying to comfort him and cool him down, hoping he would recover. But verse 20 tells us that at noon the boy died. Her miracle child, the son she had received through Elisha's promise, was suddenly dead in her arms. The woman did something remarkable in her grief. She carried her dead son up to Elisha's room and laid him on the prophet's bed. Then she shut the door and went out. She didn't tell her husband what had happened. She just asked him to send her a servant and a donkey because she needed to go to the man of God quickly. Her husband was confused, asking why she would go to Elisha on a day that wasn't a new moon or Sabbath, but she just said, "That's all right," and left. She traveled as fast as possible to Mount Carmel, where Elisha was. When Elisha saw her coming from a distance, he sent Gehazi to run and meet her and ask if everything was all right with her, her husband, and her child. Her response to Gehazi was simply, "Everything is all right, Noduri." But she was holding her grief inside until she could reach the prophet himself. When she reached Elisha, she fell at his feet and grabbed hold of them. Gehazi moved to push her away, but Elisha stopped him. Verse 27 records Elisha saying, "Leave her alone. She's in bitter distress, but the Lord has hidden it from me and has not told me why." He could see she was in deep anguish, but didn't know what had happened. Then the woman spoke words recorded in verse 28. "Did I ask you for a son, my Lord? Didn't I tell you, don't raise my hopes?" Now Elisha understood. The child was dead. This was the very thing she had feared when he first promised her a son, that having him and losing him would be worse than never having him at all. Elisha immediately sent Gehazi ahead with his staff, instructing him to lay it on the boy's face. But the woman made it clear she wouldn't leave Elisha behind. Verse 30 records her saying, "As surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you." So Elisha got up and followed her back to Shunem. Gehazi reached the house first and laid the staff on the boy's face as instructed, but verse 31 tells us there was no sound or response. The staff didn't bring the child back. Gehazi went back to meet Elisha and reported, "The boy has not awakened." When Elisha arrived at the house, he went into the room where the dead boy was laying on his bed. 2 Kings 4, verse 33 tells us, "He went in, shut the door on the two of them, and prayed to the Lord." Alone with the dead child, Elisha prayed, seeking God's intervention in this desperate situation. Then Elisha did something that seemed strange. Verse 34 describes it. Then he got on the bed and lay on the boy, mouth to mouth, eyes to eyes, hands to hands. As he stretched himself out on him, the boy's body grew warm. Elisha was physically pressing himself onto the child, as if trying to transfer life from his own body to the boy's lifeless form. He got up and walked back and forth in the room, then went back and stretched himself out on the boy again. This time, something happened. Verse 35 says, "The boy sneezed 7 times and opened his eyes. Life returned to him. The child who had been dead was alive again, breathing and conscious. Elisha called Gehazi and told him to call the Shunammite woman. When she came in, Elisha simply said in verse 36, "Take your son." She came in, fell at his feet, and bowed to the ground. Then she took her son and went out. Her miracle child had been given to her twice now, once at birth and once in resurrection. The prophet's promise had been tested by tragedy, but ultimately confirmed by an even greater miracle. Elisha returned to Gilgal during a time when there was a famine in the land. Food was scarce and people were hungry. A company of the prophets was meeting with him, and Elisha told his servant in 2 Kings 4, verse 38, "Put on the large pot and cook some stew for these men." He wanted to feed the prophets who had gathered with him. One of the men went out into the fields to gather herbs and vegetables for the stew. He found a wild vine and picked wild gourds from it, filling the fold of his cloak with them. When he came back, verse 39 tells us, he cut them up into the pot of stew, though no one knew what they were. He was just trying to help by adding more ingredients to the pot, but he had no idea what he had actually gathered. The stew was served to the men, and they began to eat it, but immediately they realized something was terribly wrong. Verse 40 records them crying out, "Man of God, there is death in the pot." The gourds were poisonous. The stew that was supposed to nourish them was actually deadly. They couldn't eat it. Elisha's response was calm and simple. He said, "Get some flour." Someone brought him flour, and he put it into the pot. Then he said, "Serve it to the people to eat." Verse 41 tells us the result, and there was nothing harmful in the pot. The poison was neutralized. What had been deadly became safe to eat. The prophets could finish their meal without any danger. Shortly after this, a man came from Baal Shalisha, bringing Elisha 20 loaves of barley bread, baked from the first ripe grain, and some heads of new grain. This was a first fruits offering, the first portion of the harvest that was supposed to be given to God. The man brought it to Elisha as God's prophet. Elisha told his servant in verse 42, "Give it to the people to eat." But his servant objected with a practical question, recorded in verse 43. "How can I set this before 100 men? 20 loaves and some grain weren't nearly enough to feed that many people. It was impossible." But Elisha insisted, giving his servant a word from the Lord, "Give it to the people to eat, for this is what the Lord says. They will eat and have some left over." It was a promise of supernatural multiplication, similar to what would happen centuries later when Jesus fed thousands with just a few loaves and fish. The servant obeyed. He set the food before the men, and verse 44 tells us the result. Then they ate and had some left over according to the word of the Lord. The 20 loaves fed 100 men with food remaining afterward. It was physically impossible, but God's word through his prophet made it reality. The men were satisfied, and the miracle demonstrated once again that God provides for those who serve him, even in times of famine. In the nation of Aram, which was often at war with Israel, there was a man named Naaman who held a high position. 2 Kings 5, verse 1 describes him. Now Naaman was commander of the army of the king of Aram. He was a great man in the sight of his master and highly regarded, because through him the Lord had given victory to Aram. He was a valiant soldier, but he had leprosy. Despite his military success and high rank, Naaman suffered from a disease that was slowly destroying him. During one of Aram's raids into Israel, they had captured a young girl who now served Naaman's wife. This girl knew about Elisha and his miraculous power. Verse 3 records her saying to her mistress, "If only my master would see the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy." Even though she was a captive far from home, she cared enough about Naaman to tell him about the prophet who could help him. When Naaman heard about this prophet in Israel, he went to his king and told him what the girl had said. The king of Aram sent Naaman to Israel with a letter to the king of Israel, along with gifts, 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 sets of clothing. The letter said in verse 6, "With this letter I am sending my servant Naaman to you so that you may cure him of his leprosy." When the king of Israel read the letter, he was horrified. Verse 7 tells us, "He tore his robes and said, 'Am I God? Can I kill and bring back to life? Why does this man send someone to me to be cured of his leprosy? See how he's trying to pick a quarrel with me.'" The king thought this was a setup, an impossible demand designed to create an excuse for war. He had no power to heal leprosy. When Elisha heard that the king had torn his robes, he sent a message recorded in verse 8. "Why have you torn your robes? Have the man come to me, and he will know that there is a prophet in Israel." Elisha was ready to help, and he saw this as an opportunity to demonstrate God's power to a foreign commander. So Naaman went to Elisha's house with his horses and chariots and stopped at the door. But Elisha didn't even come out to meet him. Instead, he sent a messenger with simple instructions recorded in verse 10. "Go, wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan, and your flesh will be restored, and you will be cleansed." That was it. No ceremony, no special prayer. Just go dip in the river 7 times. Naaman was furious. Verse 11 tells us, "He went away angry and said, 'I thought that he would surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God, wave his hand over the spot, and cure me of my leprosy.'" He had expected something dramatic, something worthy of his rank and status. Instead, he got instructions to bathe in a river. He complained further in verse 12, "Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Couldn't I wash in them and be cleansed?" From his perspective, if washing in a river was the solution, the rivers back home were better than the Jordan. He was about to leave without obeying. But his servants approached him with wise words recorded in verse 13. "My father, if the prophet had told you to do some great thing, would you not have done it? How much more then when he tells you, 'Wash and be cleansed'?" They were pointing out that if Elisha had demanded something difficult or expensive, Naaman would have done it. Why refuse to do something simple? Their words convinced him. Naaman went down to the Jordan River and dipped himself in it 7 times, exactly as Elisha had instructed. Verse 14 describes what happened. His flesh was restored and became clean like that of a young boy. The leprosy was completely gone. His skin was healthy and new, as if he had never been sick. The commander of Aram's army had been healed by the God of Israel. Naaman went back to Elisha with his whole company. This time, when he stood before the prophet, his attitude was completely different. Verse 15 records his words, "Now I know that there is no God in all the world except in Israel." He had discovered the true God through his healing. He offered Elisha a gift, but the prophet refused to accept anything. The healing was from God and wasn't for sale. The company of the prophets came to Elisha one day with a practical problem. 2 Kings 6 verse 1 records them saying, "The place where we meet with you is too small for us." They were growing in number and needed more space. They asked permission to go to the Jordan River, each cut down a log, and build a new meeting place there. Elisha agreed and even went with them when they asked. While they were cutting down trees by the Jordan, disaster struck one of the men. Verse 5 tells us, "As one of them was cutting down a tree, the iron axe head fell into the water." This might not seem like a major problem, but the man cried out to Elisha, "Oh no, my lord, it was borrowed." The axe head was made of iron, which was expensive and valuable. This man had borrowed the tool and now had lost the most valuable part of it in the river. He would have to pay for it, which he probably couldn't afford. Elisha asked, "Where did it fall?" When the man showed him the place, verse 6 records what Elisha did. He cut a stick and threw it there and made the iron float. Iron doesn't float. It's impossible. But when Elisha threw the stick into the water, the iron axe head rose to the surface as if it weighed nothing. Then Elisha simply said, "Lift it out." The man reached out his hand and took the axe head from the water, and the problem was solved. This small miracle shows the scope of Elisha's ministry. He didn't just perform dramatic miracles for important people. He cared about a poor prophet's borrowed tool. He used God's power to solve everyday problems for ordinary people. Nothing was too small for God to care about, and Elisha demonstrated that throughout his ministry. Beyond this miracle, Elisha performed many others that demonstrated God's power in different situations. He helped the king of Israel avoid ambushes by revealing enemy battle plans that God showed him. When the Syrian army surrounded the city of Dothan to capture Elisha, he prayed, and God struck them with blindness. Elisha then led them into Samaria, right into the hands of the king of Israel. During a desperate siege of Samaria when people were starving, Elisha prophesied that by the next day food would be plentiful and cheap. And it happened exactly as he said when the Syrian army fled in panic, leaving all their supplies behind. Throughout his ministry, Elisha demonstrated that God sees everything, cares about everything, and has power over everything. No situation was too big or too small for God to handle through his prophet. Elisha eventually grew old and became ill. 2 Kings 13 verse 14 tells us, "Now Elisha had been suffering from the illness from which he died." Even prophets who perform miracles weren't immune to sickness and death, but before he died, he had one more important encounter. Jehoash, the king of Israel, came down to see him. When the king saw how sick Elisha was, he wept over him and cried out the same words Elisha had spoken when Elijah was taken to heaven. Verse 14 records him saying, my father, the chariots and horsemen of Israel." The king recognized that Elisha had been Israel's true strength and defense, just as Elijah had been before him. Even on his deathbed, Elisha had a prophetic message for the king. He told him to get a bow and some arrows. When Jehoash brought them, Elisha told him to open the east window and shoot an arrow. As the king shot, Elisha declared in verse 17, "The Lord's arrow of victory, the arrow of victory over Aram. You will completely destroy the Arameans at Aphek." It was a promise of military victory. Then Elisha told the king to take the arrows and strike the ground with them. The king struck the ground 3 times and stopped. This made Elisha angry. Verse 19 records the prophet saying, "You should have struck the ground 5 or 6 times. Then you would have defeated Aram and completely destroyed it. But now you will defeat it only 3 times." The king's lack of enthusiasm and persistence would limit his victories. He would defeat Aram 3 times, as the number of strikes indicated, but he wouldn't finish them off completely. After this encounter, verse 20 tells us simply, Elisha died and was buried. The great prophet who had performed so many miracles, who had raised the dead and fed the hungry and healed the sick, died like any other man and was laid in a tomb. It seemed like the end of his story, but it wasn't. Sometime later, while Israelites were burying a man, they spotted a raiding band of Moabites coming. In their panic to get away, verse 21 tells us, they threw the man's body into Elisha's tomb. When the body touched Elisha's bones, the man came to life and stood up on his feet. Even Elisha's dead bones carried the power of God. This final miracle was a testimony that the power working through Elisha had been God's power all along, and even death couldn't stop it. From his calling at the plow to his death and beyond, Elisha had served as God's prophet to Israel for decades. Where Elijah's ministry had been marked by judgment and dramatic confrontations, Elisha's ministry was marked by provision, healing, and life. He performed twice as many recorded miracles as his master, receiving the double portion he had asked for. And through it all, he demonstrated that God cares for his people, provides for their needs, and has power over every situation they face. If this story has inspired you, challenged you, or strengthened your faith, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss future biblical stories that bring Scripture to life. Share this video with your family, friends, and church community. Someone in your life needs to hear about the faithfulness of God and the power available to those who trust Him. Leave a comment below telling us which miracle impacted you the most, or what lesson you're taking away from the lives of these two great prophets. Remember, the God of Elijah and Elisha is your God too. He hasn't changed. His power hasn't diminished. And He's still looking for people who will say, "Here I am, send me." Thank you for watching, and may the faith of these prophets inspire you to trust God more deeply in your own life.